All right, and we're live. So, greetings everyone. Saludos con todos. My name is Ugo Stornaiolo, and I am the international correspondent for España Navarra Confidencial, which is a Spanish conservative newspaper, which we promote the views of freedom and order and Christendom for the Western world, especially for the Spanish-speaking countries. Today is joining me Richard Storey, who is a British legal and political thinker, and who is going to talk with us about some topics. We're beginning mostly with law, and then we're going to move on with politics, political philosophy, and ultimately aesthetics, which is one of the things we have been discussing among each other for the last couple of weeks. So, welcome, Richard.
Thanks for having me. Good to be here.
All right. So the first thing I usually do in these episodes is for the guest to introduce himself or herself, your case, yourself, so they can add more information that I may have missed. Because, well, for the people who don't know, Richard wrote a book called The Uniqueness of Western Law, a reactionary manifesto. And by default, most people are going to think, oh, he's a lawyer or he's some kind of jurist or some kind of legal thinker. But then again, that may be misleading because it's not like you have published on other outlets. There's an essay of yours on the Mises Institute. You usually publish for Arctos, I guess. So if you could introduce yourself to our audience, that would be great.
Yeah, so as you say, I'm the author of The Uniqueness of Western Law, a reactionary manifesto. I fished this copy of it here, to make it look as though I had reread it and I was super prepared for this. Okay, so I have a master's in law. I'm very interested in law. I don't work in the area of law. It's more of intellectual study of mine. I also have a master's in linguistics, which I think is a wonderful subject because it brings together other subjects that I'm interested in, such as neuroscience, sociology, anthropology. So basically, I'm just interested in the social sciences, and I'm interested in particularly the development of what we call the West, and the values that you said interested in promoting, Hugo. The history of them, and also thinking about how these might be preserved or how they might further develop in the future. I write for Arctos. I'm also a children's book author, to give you an indication of how I care about the future and future generations. I'm a Catholic, so that's my angle. I have 4 children, and as you say, I live in the south of England.
All right, yeah, that's quite great of an introduction, especially given that, well, the thing about most thinkers and most intellectuals is that most people think you or me or intellectuals in general should be relegated to academia and should be mostly university professors or whatnot. But your case is particularly interesting because you're more of a self-thought intellectual, and that shows in your book. And that's why I wanted to begin with the discussion about your book and how you got into this idea of Western law and how you ended up developing this reactionary manifesto, and then how you continued with developing the ideas that you have been promoting for the last few years, which, as far as I can tell, there's some kind of evolution. You have clearly libertarian influences on one side, but you're not a libertarian. And for many people in the right, so to speak, this line of thinking might be somewhat dangerous. You know that they call it the pipeline, even if there's not really a pipeline. And most libertarians, at one moment or the other, especially some libertarians, end up becoming very conservative.
Yeah, all interesting points that you brought up. just to return back to the point you made about not being necessarily in academia, as in, being a lecturer or part of an academic institution. I have lots of friends who are in academia. I'm thinking of one in particular at the moment who, though I don't think he's a particularly radical thinker at all. And the man I'm thinking of, he has a lot of connections with the Mises Institute as well. A thoroughly libertarian man, but nevertheless, because of censorship, a sort of shadow censorship even within academic institutions, in my own country, he has nevertheless felt that it's more suitable for him to go and lecture in China, would you believe, where he believes he has more of a voice. He's able to say more, really, I think, very tame things. But it's no secret, is it? That there's a lot of censorship, there's a lot of cancellation. Even Sir Roger Scruton, before the end of his life, he was hounded out of the country. He was hardly able to give a talk at any university in his own country, in England, and he was given accolades and commendations, that sort of thing, elsewhere, in Hungary most notably, but not at home. And so that's kind of the background to my book, and perhaps one of the reasons why I have not necessarily wanted to enter the mainstream academia. And I do think that, obviously we'll get into this as we keep talking, but I do think that the kind of culture war, the kind of meta-political process, that the those of us further along the right seem to be going through, this kind of forces us to make alternative ways, sort of alternative kind of thinking, alternative academic thought, alternative economy even, and culture. So I mean, that's just to address that part of it. Oh, and I shouldn't forget to mention, of course, the man who wrote the afterword, Ricardo Duchenne. He was, he's a great scholar. The man's a genius. He's Puerto Rican, and he was a professor at the University of New Brunswick. He wrote a great book, and I took the title of it and adapted it for my own. His book was called The Uniqueness of Western Civilization. Simply for talking about how Western civilization as a subject has been relegated and now is almost non-existent. Now you talk about like world history. World history is a subject. Talking about certainly talking about ancient European history, so talking about the Indo-Europeans. That is almost like a really taboo subject. And for wanting to talk about this very candidly and basically he was sort of forced into early retirement, which I think is a terrible shame. But that that just gives you a flavor of the background of the book. The kind of ideas that you would seek to promote, Ugo, they're becoming less and less popular. They're completely sidelined altogether now. But then to return to what you were saying, the next thing that you said, so about me not necessarily being a libertarian, and in my book, it is aimed at Arians. And I suppose at one time I would have considered myself to be sort of orthodox libertarian, sort of even anarchistic thinker. But I think many of us who are right libertarian, intellectual thinkers, we've gone through a process where we've looked at where libertarianism actually was manifested in European history. What has made Europe and Western civilization more libertarian? What even is libertarianism? What are we talking about when we say that? And therefore, what is there to be retained? What are we actually trying to work towards? And so thinkers like Hans Hermann Hoppe, Frank van Daan, myself certainly in the book, we look especially at the medieval period of Europe, and we see, okay, actually, this is really a pinnacle of what we're talking about when we say libertarianism, when we're thinking about freedom in its optimum sense, and the Christian background that's informed that, especially all the legal theories surrounding the very idea of the individual, and having alternate and competing systems of law within the West. This is totally unique. And so what I tried to do in the book, and what others have tried to do, is to say, okay, so what is it that's unique about Europeans and the situation of Europe, which eventually led to medieval Europe and, for example, the Holy Roman Empire, where you have like free cities and you have an emperor, but this emperor is more like a first among us. He's not just some tyrant. He can't just do whatever he wants. He has to be, if he wants to go to war, he has to actually have a lot of kings and lords and knights on side, and they in turn will have all kinds of other relationships with others, and have sworn fealty to all kinds of other people. And so there's something almost contractual about this. There's something very private, very personal about this, and that situation is very unique. So where we could say, okay, I'm not what you might think of as like a very orthodox libertarian thinker, like people might think of Ayn Rand, or they might think of Murray Rothbard, certainly, or Walter Block, thinkers like that, is that I'm saying fundamentally libertarianism is this idea of negating influence on me, so others not having so much control over me, understanding how that became a part of the political process in the West, and then saying, okay, actually this grows out of the classical world, and it grows out of Christianity, and that idea of freedom is not exactly the same as the modern liberal one. So in some sense, I've gone on quite a bit here, Hugo, I'm sorry, but it's a complicated topic. So I think when we're talking about, am I a libertarian? Thinkers like Frank van Daan, are they libertarians? You've got to understand, okay, well, how are we defining liberty? What do we mean by libertarian? For me, liberty, I understand it much more in the way of St. Augustine, where it's, I need to have freedom from, my own appetites and my own shortcomings, and the more I grow in virtue and the more independent, in other ways I can make myself, in internal ways, my internal struggle, more independent I can make myself. In that sense, the freer I am. So it's not necessarily like, am I free to sell heroin to children, or some kind of horror story that people might come up with to attack, anarcho-capitalist thinkers. It's much more like, am I free from addictions, including heroin, obviously, but am I free from like screen addiction? How much control do I actually have over myself, and therefore how much power can I actually exert in the world to mean that I don't have to then be dependent on others. I don't have to relinquish, the protection of my neighborhood, for instance, to an insurance company or, something like that. So sorry to go on, Hugo. I did want to clarify that a little bit.
No, don't worry, don't worry. It's a good explanation and a good introduction to the idea of how law and freedom and a particular political and civilizational tradition are related. And when I was reading your book and when I was doing my research at the Mises Institute, because I was writing about law and economics, and most particularly about these libertarian takes on law, I came to the particular idea and the particular problem of, first of all, what is law? Law is simply a way for people to solve conflicts and to order their own behaviors so they get the best results in a sometimes in a zero sum game, sometimes in a positive sum game. The thing is that when you order relationships, when you order individual behavior of people and the social behavior of people as well, you get this idea of law. You can get law as in the simplest way, an agreement, but then it is not really law if there's no way to enforce it. So then you begin to have the problem of authority. Who has the authority to enforce these agreements, and how can they enforce them? Why they can enforce them? And so you continue with that kind of thinking, and at some point you get to the problem of, okay, yeah, this is the theoretical basis, how it actually developed, and you go to look through all of the ancient and even modern systems of law. You go through Mesopotamia, Babylon, then the Greek city-states, Rome, the Germanic peoples, and you get that there's a particular way and a particular line that goes.
Yes.
You have like the Code of Hammurabi at some point in ancient Mesopotamia. Then you have not really law, but philosophy in ancient Greece. Then you have like true, authentic law in Rome, with institutions, with magistrates, with codes, with jurisprudence, with experts, which was something that was uncommon. Actually, that they are completely new development in Roman culture and society. And then with the collapse of the Roman Empire, you have these Germanic peoples who, by the way, they were also descendant of these ancient Hindu-Europeans, Hindu-Aryan, who have their own conception of things like freedom. And you see this particular idea of freedom in their own autonomy, which then again goes to the philosophical understanding of freedom as self-government, as a freedom from whatever can chain you to your instincts or to the power of another, either of your own body or someone else. And then for the Germanic peoples, you have the idea of freedom. You have some ways that this develops into other ways. You have the Spanish fueros, which are completely derived from the Visigoths. You have the ideas of particular freedoms or traditional freedoms and individual freedoms in the English-speaking world. You have the autonomies in France. You have the way that fiefdoms, that the Holy Roman Empire was developed, each with this particular German chieftains becoming dukes and assuming the titles of the old Roman military commanders and so on and so forth, because emperor, duke, marquis, count, they're all in the origin military titles. There's a particularly close development of political institutions and of the idea of law. And then with the Enlightenment, which is like the next topic, we get a break from that traditional way of thinking about politics and about law, which was not different. You see that way, like before the Enlightenment, people who used to study law in universities with monks and with the university system in Europe, and even before of that, the people who were scholars of law were also scholars of politics, and they were also scholars of statesmanship. I can think of people like Galquin, who was one of the main advisors of Emperor Charlemagne, and so on, with many others who were like religious figures, the scholars, who were also people who knew about the law, who knew about institutions, who knew about the way to govern the state. And you had people with great charisma and with great personal power and great personal authority, who were mostly military commanders who followed the advice of these scholars. And that was the way of running things back then. With the Enlightenment, there's a break in this, and the consequences, we're living them right now. You have the problem of the managerial state, you have the problem
Yes.
of modern liberalism, you have progressivism, you have fights between what could be considered the right between, oh, are you a libertarian, are you a conservative, are you a reactionary or a traditionalist? There is no longer the same kind of unity, not even in thought, that used to exist back in the Middle Ages. The Middle Ages would be like the final stage in a great line of development of political and legal thought.
Yeah, that's right. Yeah, I mean, that's a good a good summary of how things develop legally throughout the West. I mean, one of the reasons I think it's so important to understand where we've come from and exactly why it was that law developed so strangely and uniquely in the West in a way that it didn't anywhere else, is because that is the key then for understanding why this break in modernity, why that happened. And as much as many libertarians may not like to hear this, it's very, very important. Basically, Europeans are much more individualistic. Okay, my thinking for that, the reason I think that that's the case, and I follow Ricardo Duchenne in that, is because we're largely descended from, as you said, the Indo-Europeans. Now, these are nomads, a bit like perhaps, say, the early Ottoman tribes were, or the Mongols, the Turks, original Turks, these kinds of groups, Huns perhaps. So they were nomads, basically. They didn't settle, they didn't create cities. They were very mobile because they had cattle, and they lived off their cattle. They roamed around on horses, very violent, warlike. Imagine maybe like something like Conan the Barbarian. Maybe that's like kind of an image that might come to mind. But the Indo-European nomads, they did something rather special in that they used the wheel, not for some kind of domestic or agricultural use. They turned it into chariots, and so all of a sudden they could travel very, very far, very, very fast for the time, and they were undefeatable on the battlefield from that point. Now, those ancestors, they were quite clearly psychopathic. So they would engage in berserker warfare. They would strip naked, so to deliberately be without armor. So, for those of you who've read the Iliad, Homer's Iliad, you can get an idea of where that culture is coming from. Maybe they would paint themselves up, and they would do all that. So they would completely flout, their safety in battle. They wanted maximum glory. Now, to do that requires a great deal of psychopathy. What psychopathy? Obviously, okay, so that's like a sort of very, very, very masculine brain. So your degrees of empathy are maybe a bit more detached from other people. So it tends to be CEOs, tend to be more psychopathic, for instance. But also, okay, interestingly, even today, We see that in white people, if you want to call it that, basically people who have European heritage, they seem to have a higher degree of psychopathy. And I think that that's probably largely genetic, and I think it comes from those early nomads. And I think that not only does it explain, why the trajectory of European politics meant that, the ancient Greeks, they said, hold on a minute, no, we're not going to have some tyrant in Phoenicia tell us what to do. We're going to have our own city. We're going to, band together into a small group, shields and spears, form phalanx, and we're going to do our own thing, and we're going to figure out what's right and what's wrong in society, i.e. law. We're going to figure that all out for ourselves just through rational thinking. We're going to just discover it. We're going to find it out. So you can see there, like the flower bed, if you like, of where individualism and liberal thought and humanism and all of that stuff is coming from. The Europeans are just always going to be a little bit more individualistic. And so, okay, that meant that then by the time you get to the medieval period, passing by, I'm just sweeping past Roman law because you've already explained it, the Romans followed that same process that the Greeks had started, and they developed the law courts. They developed the whole system around this rational process of discovering law. By the time we get to the medieval period, you have Christianity, which is, still taking that Platonic philosophy and that Roman law and theology, all of this exploration using the rational mind to discover things. And then they meet the Germanic tribes, and lo and behold, because they are also descended from the same people and they're also pretty individualistic, well, they kind of have a similar system going on, where you have different kings and lords, and they don't just kill all the other kings and lords so that they are the one top dog and there's only one tyrant, like you might have seen, in the Orient, for instance. No, they want other guys around. They want other kings around so that they can show off. They can have kudos, from their peers. Okay, so then you end up with this aristocratic system where you have all these warriors, swearing loyalty and fealty to each other, and you have kind of the beginning of what we would think of as being libertarianism. Because if we're not just going to just kill the other guy, I'm just going to kill the other lord. No, there are some rules that we have discovered through this rational process of philosophy that govern us all, and they apply to all. They apply to the emperor, they apply to the king, they apply to everyone. It's not just you have some tyrant at the top who says, I'm the sun god, now do everything I say. No, the Greeks did away with that. They said, we're not having that. No, we've discovered laws, and everybody needs to obey them. There are even laws that govern the king. God-given laws, no less. So that's the system. That's how we arrive at something, more closely approximating libertarianism. So what is this break that you're talking about with modernity? What is that? How did that come about? Okay, well, where you have really this started in the Middle Ages, where you had the beginnings of some ideas of saying, how can we break free of cultural authorities? How can we break free from some of these rules and maybe start this process of being little tyrants ourselves and just, making our own rules? It began with thinkers like William of Ockham and Duns Scotus and guys like that in the Middle Ages. where, basically they started to question the authority of the church, really, and this idea of, the corporate body of Christ, which encompasses all of Christendom, and we're all one organic political unit, basically, across Europe. And as that developed, and as it started to become more profitable, because towards the end of the Middle Ages, basically, Islam was not quite in the same position of power as it was. It wasn't blocking Europe off quite as much from trade. And also there was the possibility of finding other routes of trade to the rest of the world. So there began in Italy the development of what we would call modern capitalism. And people then began to seek out and patronize people to develop their own systems of law, which would assist with that and kind of break free from what they saw as being the church's constraints on things like usury, basically, banking and that sort of thing. And that idea, eventually spread into Germany and the Netherlands and England. And eventually, this is my take, this resulted in the Protestant Reformation. So I think the individualistic trend said, okay, you know what? Look, let's just have our own Bibles. We're going to read our own Bibles for ourselves. We're going to make our own decisions, and maybe sort of in a national realm. The king is, God's regent on earth to a great extent. So we're going to have national churches, national currencies, national systems of education. So there was a kind of, a breaking away, let's say. And this then made it possible in the imaginations of the Europeans to then say, well, let's go all the way. Let's become liberal in all of our thought. And so, obviously then, later you have thinkers like Hobbes, like John Locke, like Hume, to an extent. And you have what we call the Enlightenment, which is basically like the individualistic revolution, if you like, of Europe. I mean, that's certainly how I see it. And so, what then is left to govern people? How do you govern people? If we are, as Hobbes then saw us, once this idea had taken hold in the European mind, as it's all against all, deep dog. We're fundamentally, red in tooth and claw, as he said, and we're all at war with each other, individuals against individuals for resources in this cruel world. If that's how it is, we can only rely on ourselves, we can only stand on our own 2 feet as individuals. Okay, what or who is going to keep the peace? How can we have any kind of polity when it's like that? And this is where the idea of the modern state comes from. So whereas before modernity, in Europe, what formed political power? Okay, well, it was largely these rationally determined, very Platonistic principles and laws and ideas that we discover, and they apply to all of us. They're over all of us, and natural systems of hierarchy that form and adhere to all of this. And then there was this switch that came about, this individual revolution, and all of a sudden everything then is just reduced to what's the contract between any 2 private parties, say. Now, a lot of libertarians are not going to like what, because they're going to be contractarian. They think, yeah, okay, why not just reduce everything down to the individual? why not just reduce everything down to private, contractual relationships between individuals? Doesn't that make things great in the marketplace? Look what markets can accomplish. Whereas I say, I think we've gone too far. I think we've gone into a kind of hyper individualism, and what that necessitates, what modern liberalism necessitates, is the existence of a state. And actually, before modernity and before this individualistic revolution, what we really had there is something much closer to what libertarians really want and really perceive as the ideal. And so I think that libertarians are missing a trick there. And basically, that is wanted my book to be about.
Yeah, of course. And the thing is that I do agree with that particular perspective because, well, most of the libertarians who are intellectually mature enough, at least, they end up rediscovering this tradition, more classical, and they begin to abandon the Enlightenment myth. That is, that pretty much the development of Western civilization uh, begins with the Enlightenment, and the Enlightenment is what makes us as we are today. And yes, they're right. The Enlightenment is the cause of all of our issues and the way that we behave and the way our institutions work and so on and so forth. But that is not a good thing, especially if you are into libertarianism and libertarian circles. You have an ideal, and that ideal is self-government, free markets, it's free association. Great, cool. They try to plaster that ideal into the early United States, either whatever happened before the Civil War, the ideas of Alexis de Tocqueville when relating his travels to America, even the age of the Articles of Confederation, the thoughts of the Federalist Papers, and so on and so forth. They try to just say, no, the early American experiment in government, that's the libertarian ideal. But they are not thinking what was the basis for the founding fathers of the USA to actually come to that idea, because they were particularly well educated and they had some kind of formation aside from Enlightenment ideas. Of course, the Enlightenment thinkers also had another kind of education and also had knowledge about the past and about previous systems of governments and so on and so forth. And you can trace this back even to the classic works.
Yes.
Homer, Cicero, Ovid, so on and so forth, Plato, Aristotle. And the thing is that, at least right now in the contemporary age, you have the problem that many people don't go back enough to the classics, don't go back enough to the Middle Ages, don't try to understand the whole process, the intellectual genealogy of ideas, to understand where we are and why we are right now. And the easiest legal problem we see is when it comes to administrative law. I like to talk about administrative law because it's very descriptive of the problem itself. Why do we have so many public regulations for any kind of issue? And that is because we have the institutions to make micromanagement of societies possible. You have regulations because you need middle management. You need middle management because you have a whole apparatus that allows you to have power. I'm not talking about authority. To have power over large groups of people. You have that power to either coerce them into doing something like getting them to pay taxes or to get them to behave in a particular way. And you have this system like constitutionally implemented, not only in one country, but in all of them. And that is because you had the idea of constitutions and you had the idea of nominalism and you're fighting against universals. The whole idea of the Enlightenment is that people themselves, it's very Gnostic in a sense. People themselves cannot be free. They need to be pushed into freedom. They need to be taught the right way to be free. It's not that each people has a way to be free. Each people can like find the universal freedom and the universal order. by their own rational means, which is what happened in the Middle Ages, which is what happened in Greece. That's why you had many different polities. That's why even in the Holy Roman Empire, you had different dukedoms and counties and fiefdoms, and they were only united in the figure of the emperor, who was more of a military leader. That's why you also had in
Yeah.
Spain, in France, in Italy, even different political regimes in the same place. In Italy, you had kingdoms and you had republics, you had the papacy. In France, you had the pretty similar system to that of the Holy Roman Empire at first, which then centralized. In Spain,
Mm.
you had the union of various crowns at some
Yes.
moment under the same figure, but all of them with different legal systems and with different rules and laws. But then
Mm.
with the Enlightenment and with the ascent of humanism and the Renaissance, even before, you have this development of the no, we don't have universals, we only have particulars, that goes from even
Mm.
nominalism and Willem of Ockham. And no, we have
True.
to do it this way. And this way is the universal way to create something that's very particular, or particular. We, the Enlightenment thinkers, we, the humanists, we, the Renaissance masters, we are the ones who know. And you don't, because you are not enlightened enough. It's very Gnostic if you think
Hmm.
about it. Our
Yeah,
problem in
absolutely.
general, our problem in
Sorry,
general
please
is
go
that,
on.
yeah, no, it's that the development of Western civilization since the end of the Middle Ages has been polluted by Gnostic thinking, and you find this not in libertarian authors. You find this in libertarian, in conservative thinkers like Eric Vogelin. And back to my
Mm.
original point, when you begin to look at the history of the development of intellectual history and the history of ideas, you begin
Mm.
to understand why most sound libertarians end up becoming more conservative and reactionary as they grow older. You have even, well, let's begin with the father of the Austrian school, with Karl Menger. One of his latest books, like before he died, was a little book on institutions. And he, of course, he talked about money, but he also considered about the development of law. You have Mises, who became more of a traditionalist in the end. We had this
Mm.
discussion back at the Mises Institute about what Mises really was. Our take is that Mises was not a classical liberal, but he was not a conservative either. He was kind of his own thing, like
Yes, true.
the scion of a reactionary empire, who was a particularly very liberal for that reactionary empire. Then you have
Yes.
Hayek with law, legislation, and liberty, who also became quite conservative. He even got in touch with the TFP association and with Catholic traditionalist Plinio Correa de Oliveira, who was also a free marketer, by the way.
Huh.
You had Rothbard, who became more reactionary in the end.
Yes.
Hapa, who was influenced by Eric von Kunet-Ledin, and who also was quite conservative, and he had this kind of medieval thought.
Yeah.
You had Frank Van Don
Yeah.
and David Dorr, who are still living, who are legal scholars, and who go back into that medieval thinking. And that's the
Yes.
thing. Once you get past the Enlightenment trap of thinking, no, everything began with the Enlightenment, and the American experiment in government was its realization, and that's why we should look back to that. That's the point when you begin to understand that the lines between libertarianism and the rest of the right are blurred, and that left libertarians, like model libertarians, progressives who just take the discourse of freedom, they are not the norm. They are just people who took a particular school of thought and just kept perverting it into the Enlightenment ideal.
Mm. Yeah. I totally agree. Um, yeah, interesting. Some of the things you just said there, I didn't know. I mean, with a figure like Murray Rothbard, for instance, it's perhaps more well known because he was writing his history of economics, and then he gets to right. I'm going to totally get to grips with the Middle Ages and what's going on there, and unfortunately, he passed away. And it seems like then since that time libertarians have then done a deep dive into the classical world, into the medieval period, and I've tried to then totally make sense of this than myself, and to say, basically, yes, we do want greater freedom, but how does that actually then manifest and work? And try to read these things for yourself. Don't just, for instance, read Ayn Rand, who seemingly loved Aristotle. But then you go and read Aristotle's Politics, and the guy is not what we would call an individualist at all. You read it and you think, well, where does Ayn Rand even, what's her grip on this at all? I'm not seeing any of her thought anywhere here, because Aristotle fundamentally sees not individuals. For Aristotle and for medieval thinkers, there is an individual sense that we would understand it. Yes, of course. Okay, we've got our own soul. We're responsible for God, for our own soul. Women and children included. This was part of the Christendom's breakaway from Rome. A father isn't the owner of his wife and children like they're cattle, and he can just execute them, brutalize them, which comes from, well, a particular figure. You can go and Google that one. You can't just execute your children. They have a soul. They're made in the image of God. They've got a responsibility for their soul before God as well. So, okay, maybe Aristotle would have understood individual like in that sense, but for him and for Aquinas, whoever, at no point in a normal human life do you have like some completely isolated person. You grow up, from the womb. Your brain is developing a sense of the other as it hears the heartbeat of your mother. Once you're born, you're nurtured with unconditional love from someone. You have to be, otherwise you wouldn't be here. You're given a language. Don't choose one for yourself. In a language, you have metaphors and all sorts of different things literally constructed in your brain, and you don't get to choose any of that. And that informs how you view the world, how you're going to interact with the world, how you're going to interact with others, how you're going to think of yourself. So for Aristotle, there isn't necessarily the individual in the modern sense of the individual. We're all just this blank slate, and you do you, and you're completely free to develop yourself in whatever way you can possibly think of. That doesn't exist in the older world, but they still concepts of freedom. They still had a concept of you, Hugo. You can get to grips with philosophy, and you can develop a new idea that is, your idea, and you can, write your name at the bottom of that. Of course, they still had those ideas, but their thinking was more corporatist. You grow up in a family, and that's a little unit. It's the smallest unit in Aristotle's thinking, not the individual. And for the ancient Greeks, they built that up to polis, which is basically like, people translate as city-state, because they looked at what the Greeks were developing. They were developing these little cities, and so they said, well, it's a state, it's a city, it's a city-state. But it's maybe better to think of the polis as being a political community. We're naturally inclined to want to do that. Look at all these libertarians going to New Hampshire, for instance, Hugo, in America. What are they trying to do? They're trying to create a political community. They realize, we need to band together. We need to create a movement. They naturally want to be a part of a corporate body to protect themselves, just as the Greeks did. And so I suppose my angle is a little bit more saying to libertarians, abandon the idea, the enlightenment idea of the individual, because that didn't exist, and that wasn't what libertarianism, as we would actually know it and how it was properly manifested, that isn't what it grew out of. That's not the European heritage. Yes, we're more individualistic. Okay, yeah, that makes us more, innovative. And in Europe and in the West, you have competing schools of thought, which is just not something you would see, for instance, in Chinese civilization. Yeah, we have competing schools of thought, but that doesn't mean that we don't form organic units, which take on a life of their own, like families, like guilds in the medieval period, like universities, which used to be different. They weren't just like local businesses, they are. And also, so I think political communities. And that doesn't have to be big, like you're saying, Hugo. That can get really big, and that can mean that you need centralization, and you need all this management, and you end up with the managerial state. That was one of the big problems you were pointing out, Hugo, and that's exactly right. The way I think you get to that is through individualism. If it's all about, relationship between these individual atomized units, you need then a middleman to manage all of those different units. If you're already a part of a group, and so your sense of personhood and rights and representation and everything from that, and you don't dissociate yourself apart from that any more than, like I think of myself, and I'm fundamentally a father. I don't think of myself as like totally detached from my family and my children. That's now fundamental to my sense of self, my identity. If you're a part of communities like that, and you wouldn't have it any other way, you would die for those things. You love those things. You love that community. Then you don't need middlemen. You don't need this managerial state, and we could, have something much more organic and much more like we had pre-modernity. How we get there, that's a whole other question, and maybe something we'll talk about.
Yeah, and I mean, this is the thing with. I would consider this is one of the main paradoxes of libertarianism, and which can be tackled way better by more conservative-minded people. And from then, I'm going to even go to the subject of aesthetics, which I think could be a good way to conclude. But first, this conservatives, at least more classical conservatives, and I use this particular designation more than the one that people are used to. Conservatives in a more European sense, or conservative who have a better education and understanding, they tend to see the Aristotelian way of the world, that is communitarianism. Sadly, in the US, you have seen, and even in the UK with Thatcher and the way the Conservative Party has took since the 80s, you see that the conservatives have lost their way in the sense that they try to promote individualism just by the means of the market. And you see this in every other institution, and they have completely lost their way. They don't know what they are fighting for. They don't know what they are even defending. And when you reread some of the books and some of the classics of modern conservatives, I would say even like 20th century conservatives, and then further back, you'll see that there is a particular sense of communitarianism that should be retaken. When you read Russell Kirk, when you reread Richard Weaver, when you go back to Alexis de Tocqueville, Burke. I'm not talking about clearly reactionary types like Carl Schmitt or Donoso Cortés or Joseph de Maistre, because they are not the ones that should be considered when it comes to community building, to sociology. Schmidt and Donoso Cortés and Hobbes, they should all be looked in when you try to understand the dynamics of power, which is something very few libertarians understand. Most of the libertarians who are actually into power dynamics and into power politics, they usually have some kind of legal training or some kind of legal education. I would say Carlo Lottieri, Frank Van Doon, David Durr, but that's because by by their own situation of being legal scholars or being legal practitioners, they know that power is different from the kind of political ideal thinking of most libertarians who are only into political philosophy. So these people, they understand a different dimension from the ones that more classical conservatives understand, which is that of the community. Yeah, we have to build organic communities. Yes, we have to engage in free association. Yeah, of course. But then when you have a community, how you engage, how you promote and distribute power and authority. And for most libertarians, the issue is they don't distinguish between power and authority. Authority comes organically into a corporate community, a corporate body. You have authority in the family, you have authority in the church, you have authority in the guild, you have authority in the polity, let's say in the city, even in the managerial state. You have some level of authority. Someone is actually making people follow them, not because he has more power, but because they follow him because he has personal authority. And then you have the issue of power enforcement, which is different. How you make people follow what you're saying. Because not many people, and not all of them, are going to follow you just because you're you, and because you're intelligent or you're wise or you're handsome or whatever. That's the thing about authority. Authority is different from power. And most libertarians don't get to understand this, especially because they don't get to understand law. And when you consider these two things, that's when you try to engage in different ways of thinking. That's when you get out of like the libertarian or the US conservative way of thinking of free markets and I don't know else. That's when you try to understand the value of family, the value of nation, the value of even race, if you're into that kind of stuff. It's a very complicated subject, to be honest, especially in places like mine, in Latin America. We don't really get to understand that because we're pretty mixed in general. But in places like the US, in which there's not that many assimilation, or in Europe, in which you have ethnic states, like a combination of ethnic states all bordering each other, this is a very different subject. But then you consider these combinations, and it's not only about like material freedom and the prosperity that markets can give you, which of course is great and it makes for people to be better in their lives. It's also about the institutions that make people live as human beings, which is the ones that were being taken, that were being wrought by the managerial experiment and by global institutions at the current moment. And I don't know if you have seen the actual goals that are promoted by organizations such as the United Nations or the current take that the European Union has taken, or even like the most of the cathedral under like blue states regimes and the Democratic Party in the US. It's all about destroying, breaking up like to the last single piece these corporate bodies, these corporate spheres. And that's the point in which you begin to think maybe individualism wasn't that great after all. My free markets are not going to run themselves by individuals who have nothing and no one around them. And if you look at this, most people who are into individualism, they don't get another sense of understanding, which is very important, and I think should be the last thing we should talk about, which is aesthetics. Politics, in the sense that if law is a political tool, and politics are downstream from culture, and culture is downstream from religion, how you get the other side of that abstract tool, which is law. And I would say that the most material you can engage materially tool from politics is aesthetics, because aesthetics is something you see, something you perceive, something that you can engage in the place, in the time, in the space. So I think this could be like the last topic, because yeah, of course, law has a particular development, but the development of law and of Western institutions and civilization, at least in the legal political sense, also comes with a very particular kind of aesthetics. You don't get the kind of aesthetics like the Pantheon in Rome, or the Fora. You don't get the Parthenon, and you don't get the Greek poly as a whole system of aesthetics, as a whole architectural system. You don't get these naked warriors from ancient Greece. You don't get the development of the wheel. You don't get heraldry in Europe, in medieval Europe, and you don't get symbols as the ones that we have right now. You don't get the global homo corporate aesthetics that you see on Facebook every day, if there wasn't some kind of relationship between law, between rules, and the ways these are promoted aesthetically, materially, and the ways they have to be perceived by other people. So if you could add something to that, because there's a particular thing about aesthetics which, at least in our circles, like right-wing circles, conservative circles, libertarian circles, we tend to go quite a lot into vaporwave and into neon aesthetics. But I think this is just a very current and very contemporary trend, which is not really the thing that has been happening in history.
Yeah, you go. I agree with so much for what you said there. It, I, I think, we're in a position where, I was saying at the start of this talk, even within academia, so within institutions, they're all gone. None of them are accessible to us, or so many of our ideas. Certainly not the political institutions. And how, when we don't have institutions, when we're all atomized individuals now, how are you going to just build a movement organically to challenge any of that? You're saying that the cathedral, we have no subsidiary powers, to use the power language. We don't have the subsidiary. We're on the periphery, and no power takes the throne. Takes the central power from the periphery. It just doesn't happen. Maybe you have like terrorists or something, but we're all Christians. We're not about anything like that. So we're just far from the seat of power, basically, and we don't have any proper institutions anymore, and we can't really look to the highest ranks of the church so much, because that's sort of been swamped with liberalism as well. So that's our position. So where do we go? We don't have politics, so we resort to metapolitics. And okay, did this emerge from the left? Well, I think, thinking about this in much more concrete ways, and thinking about it more strategically, kind of came from a Gramsci, who, of course, was a communist. And he's the guy who, thought about the long march through the institutions and changing ideas in people's minds, changing the culture. And we haven't been very good at that over the past 20 years. People who are sort of, more radical on the right and really see the problems that we're dealing with and talk about the kinds of things we've been talking about, Hugo. We sound just really autistic, and we don't sound like we can hold like normal conversations with normies. We're talking about like William of Ockham and nominalism and stuff. People have got no idea what we're talking about, Hugo. But we have so much to give, and we have ideas that can really change people's minds and lower those intellectual defenses that everybody has, and really speak to them at an emotional level, which is really where the vast majority of people operate. That's largely why I decided to become a children's author. Ugo is basically just to speak to children in a way that they will understand, about the kind of things that we've been talking about here. But it's not just with children, although with children, the lines between what's fantasy and what's reality are more fluid. But with adults as well, basically we're in a culture war, and the way we win it is, well, look at Christ's example. Christ came and he only spoke in parables. We're told he only taught in parables. Well, that's the great genius of Christ, is with stories, with evoking emotions in people. It's not like you're starting an intellectual argument or a debate. Nobody's interested in that. People don't want to, you to come and say to them, "Oh, well, actually, you're wrong about this, and I've read lots of stuff, like you and I probably have done countless times, and it just doesn't work." People don't want to hear it. They're not on that level. But if they engaged in a character in a story, and they developed an emotional bond with them, and the music swells, and they learn the kind of lesson that we would want them to see, and it would resonate with them because it's true. Things we want to talk about, we care about the truth, Hugo, and we are really fixated on arriving at the correct answer. Well, for people, you need to get through that defense mechanism of, how dare you challenge my beliefs? And the way you do that is through emotions. It's through narratives. It's through story. It's through poetry. It's through beauty. It's through beauty, beautiful truths, and things that people just intuitively, they know in their own selves, a subconscious level even. They know it's true and they know it's good. This is where aesthetics comes in. This is where art and the parable, this is where it comes in. And I think all of like the vaporwave stuff and the retro wave stuff, you look at what it's evoking. It's you see there lots of images of ruins and ruined statues. That there's this idea there of and what else is there? Okay, so it seems to be sort of very 80s, 90s depictions of the future. Well, the 80s and 90s, just before, the past 20 years, where every so much agree that though I don't know if I dropped for a moment there, but basically it's been in the past 20 years really that cancelling all of the old ideas, cancelling all of the old organic traditional ways of thinking, in this 80s optimism about the future, thinking about the future before. So there's also this idea of past loss, but of a future, this idea of a future that's then been stolen from us as well. And so the vaporwave stuff, even though none of it's explicit, there's the lost past and there's the stolen future. optimism. So this is why all of the nostalgia then around vaporwave and about the retro wave stuff, all of that is so evocative and it's so popular. It's because it's touching on things that people know subconsciously. They know it's true. And of course, it's pleasing to you of like an exciting shopping mall, American shopping mall from the 80s. It all seemed very, very exciting. Neon lights. And of course, it reminds you of optimistic sci-fi from those periods where the future was going to be bright and really exciting, and the need of that. But I think all of that stuff is conjuring, and it's kind of speaking to deep in the soul of people. That's why I think it's so popular. But we need to continue to build something from that. I don't think it's enough for metapolitics isn't just supposed to remain metapolitics. It's not just supposed to be about changing culture. It's changing culture because, as you've said already, you want that to then manifest as something political. You want it to make a change. And also, it's not just cultural. We say we're in a culture war, but it's not just about culture. It's also about creating like parallel institutions. You want a traditional environment. Okay, find a traditional church and sort of like help to build that up, help to make like an actual community out of that. You want you see how there's not enough like economic power behind certain aspects of the right politically. Okay, to create parallel economies, and there are opportunities to do that. I think that's largely what Gab.com is about. You look what Andrew Torba says about it. He wants to build an entire like parallel economy. I think that's what's going on in his mind. It's about this parallel alternative kind of thing. And I think that's why the Sigma male thing is so popular. We were talking about that recently, weren't we? I think that the Sigma male, what's the guy from Drive? The actor, his name's completely
Ryan
gone out of my
Gosling.
mind.
Ryan Gosling.
That's it. Yeah, Ryan Gosling. Thank you. You know what I mean? The Ryan Gosling type, quiet Sigma male. Like same thing in Blade Runner, right? Perfect casting for a Blade Runner sequel. It's meme magic. But this idea of the Sigma male, because he's driving at night. Yeah, he's driving at night, and there's like the retro wave music. Why is he driving at night? Because he doesn't fit into the system. He's not a part of the mainstream. And he's a Sigma male. He's this lone wolf. He's detached. He does not fit into the system. That's why that like Sigma male figure resonates, and it touches us so deeply, because that's how it feels. That's how it feels. So all of that stuff, the aesthetics, it's great, but it needs to be aimed towards something. It needs to be moving us towards something, which is, I think, parallel institutions, parallel economy, creating our own communities. That's something I talk about in the book, the way I think things are going. And I've only seen it grow like that since I wrote the book. I think that's the trend. I think that's the trend for the future. I've spoken enough. Please, I want to hear what you have to say, because you've written a great article on this topic.
Yeah. So the thing about vaporwave and about the neon aesthetics, and nowadays, and particularly in the last, I would say, 6 months, which I've seen, there has been an explosion of the Sigma male and literally me aesthetics over the internet, is that it reflects something. Of course, there's the sense of nostalgia. Why are you trying to get the neon and the ruins and the ancient art thing combined? What are you trying to imply with all of that? Then, of course, the use of metapolitics. You try to engage through aesthetics to try to promote ideas. And I remember when I first got into political aesthetics, that aesthetics is pretty much that the material realization of an abstract idea. And when you look at some of the aesthetics, the vaporwave aesthetics is very similar to some of uh, the light, the highly illuminated medieval churches. I don't know if you have seen one of the. I don't even know how to say this thing in English. And both in Spanish, in French, in Polish, they are called like vitrales, vitrail, vitra. They're like these illuminated windows in the churches that represent some kind of a biblical scene. You've seen those at Notre Dame and at any other cathedral, like Christian cathedral. And if you look at the way churches are presented themselves, they, at least the Church of St. Mary here in Krakow, it looks beautiful and has like plenty of colors. It's a red church built completely in the color red with the red bricks, and the ceiling of the church is blue with golden stars. And then if you look at some of the churches that have been built by followers of Plinio Correa de Oliveira, of the TFP, and of the heralds of the gospel movements within the church, they also try to promote that same like brightly colorful idea, which incorporates colors, elements similar to those of vaporwave. And I've been thinking about that quite a lot because our modern society is very gray. You don't see that much color. You don't see that much reflection of light in the pure physical sense. And when you look at the mood of people like from the last 30, 40 years, mood has been declining. People are no longer happy, at least not happy in the sense that you would remember people in the 80s. The rates of people consuming and the antidepressant drugs and of consuming drugs in general, the rise of hookah culture, all of these kinds of things, they lower the mood of the people, of society, of communities. And so the rise of vaporwave and of Sigma, literally me, internet culture, it reflects that there's something happening, especially with the mind of men. Most men are feeling like they don't belong, that they try to get back into that colorful past that they have been robbed of, and that they cannot no longer have in the future. They want that, they need that. Now, if you have seen the movie like Blade Runner 2047, I guess it's another Ryan Gosling
49,
movie.
I think.
Oh yeah, it's another Ryan Gosling movie.
Yeah.
And the thing is that if you see a lot of the movies that are promoting to Sigma cinema, Joker, like American Psycho, they all reflect some kind of personality that is no longer achievable by men in our contemporary world. And a kind of like a life of luxury, a particular sense of belonging or not belonging, but to be able to lead, especially in a very dark and gray environment. The aesthetics, they represent that. What is the aesthetic you're trying to break? Who are you trying to become in a society that no longer has color, that no longer has any kind of possible future? I mean, if you want to create parallel institutions, you have plenty of ways, and this is pretty much what vaporwave and Sigma, literally me, a culture is creating. If you see any of those movies, you see that they're the stories of a single man who somehow gets control of his life and of his destiny. And with vaporwave, you see it's trying to return color to something. Vaporwave is particularly colorful because corporate culture is not colorful. If you see the kind of global homo trend that any corporation is using, pastel colors, simple shapes, not many lines, vaporwave is the complete opposite of that. It's like borderline epileptic if you consider it like in very, very artistic terms. And the political message of all of that is we're trying to get back something that has been robbed. It's not only about getting back the color of society, getting back the color of the future. It's about getting back the future that would have been. And I was I remember talking to a friend like a long time ago, I think 2 years at most, and we're talking that for him the right aesthetics would be something similar to the Belle Epoque in Europe, which was like a period of detente after the final revolutions, after the final reconfigurations of political of geopolitics and of internal politics in the European continent. But you had some sense of clarity, you had some sense of stability for once. That's when things began to like have a particular aesthetic. Then it became the jazz era after the war. The war was just like a particular point of time in which everything was cut. But in the Belle Epoque, you had colors, and if you see the art, impressionism, and all of the French paintings and the music of that time, they reflect that people had a particular kind of mood. They were happy, even if like they had been through a century of war and revolution. Finally, they had the peace that they were striving so much to get. After a whole century of many issues of wars and conflicts and empires and reconfiguration all over, you finally had stability and you could engage in the things that you hadn't engaged. There was no more romanticism. There was no more militarism. There was just a time in which people could try to live at peace. And the aesthetics of the Belle Epoque were the ones that influenced somehow the aesthetics of then the post-war. Because if you look at the aesthetics of like Marxism and the nationalist movements of the 30s, they take something that is not really known about like the Belle Epoque, and that is also the rise of imperialism in the rest of the world. That's why when you look at fascist uniforms, they tend to be very similar to the uniforms of the colonial and expeditional forces in Africa. And when you look at the symbols of some of these movements as well, they tend to try to get back some kind of the traditional elements that were taken by another half century of reconfiguration. That's why in Spain you have the yoke and the arrows. That's why in Italy you have the fasces as a reminder of the Roman Empire. In France you had the Francisque as a reminder of the ancient Gaulish people, and in Germany you had the very, you know, which symbol. It is very. We don't have to talk about the Austrian painter. This would get the channel and ourselves banned. But the thing is that in aesthetics, this is something. This is something that the fascist movements and the communists, not the liberals, mind you. Liberals are not good at, and anyone who follows a liberal Enlightenment tradition is not going to be good at aesthetics, except maybe Romanticism. But Romanticism is dead. Romanticism is dead since at least 150 years. The thing is that communists, they realized that they could get into the more modern and industrial aesthetics. They could take all of the power of industry, of machinery, and make it, this is our aesthetics. We're going to promote this. We are the future. We are the machine. And fascists on the other side, they took something different. They decided, no, you know what? We're going to take everything that people was striving for before the complicated times, and we're going to promote it as our ideal. So you had these two conflicting aesthetics. You had the conflicting aesthetics of the machine, and you had the aesthetics of the lost past, or the lost present, if you will. Sometimes in some movements, you see there's a mix of the two, especially in the movements that had more socialist influence in the nationalist side, and that had more nationalistic influence in the socialist side. For instance, you see that like Germany, they also had their fair share of like industrial aesthetics, and some of the plans by Albert Speer and some of the hierarchs of the Nazi party, they promoted that kind of industrial aesthetics because they were more close to the socialist than to the nationalist side. In Italy, the same with futurism, because futurists, they were more close to socialism just by default, the fact that they were artists and they would have been more left-leaning. And then in Soviet Russia, you see that there's a clear break between like a more industrial aesthetic in propaganda that was promoted with Lenin and the more patriotic propaganda that was promoted under Stalin. And this is the kind of things that you see, the idea that you're trying to engage people in. You engage with people when it comes to aesthetics, and especially political aesthetics, about making them think of something they want or something they would want as an ideal of a future. Because politics is not only about the present, it's about the future, planifying for the future. This is something that libertarians also don't understand. Libertarians think it's about the individual in the present, and the ones who begin to realize about long-term consequences and about long-term thinking, they tend to become more conservative because of the same reason. But socialists, except like the most progressive ones, which are, I would say, cannon fodder for the actual progressive elites right now. Socialists and progressives in general, they tend to think very much into long-term institutions and long-term plans. And even nationalistic figures and nationalistic movements, they also had like long-term plans. The problem is that we are not talking about long-term plan. Even if you look at some of the like high globalist agendas, the UN and in Brussels, the Democratic Party, they are just putting like a specific time in which you have to achieve something. Let's say 2030, but this is not long term. This is like very short term, especially with the kind of technology we have right now. Time is beginning to feel like more has a high velocity. It is very accelerated right now. And part of the problem with aesthetics is that how can you try to promote an eternal idea, or at least a very long-term idea, a very long-time idea, something that is meant to endure in history, if you feel that time is accelerating and that history is ending sooner, that everything is becoming more easy, more fast?
I think you've hit it, and I think I think that's what, in many ways, a successor from kind of Art Deco, Art Nouveau, and sort of Belle Epoque things you mentioned there, and also like all the other movements that you just mentioned. Yes, it's different, but the thing that makes it different is let's say, for instance, in the Belle Epoque, people felt like, now we can take control and not put away war and ugly things, and it's time to take control of that. With whatever we may call it in the future, whatever this movement going on now, whatever it is, the difference of that is that we feel the future has been stolen from us in control. And so what it immediately screams to me on art is like, I'm not done dreaming. I remember that period. I remember like the 80s and the 90s. I remember them. And I'm not done with that dreaming. I'm still going to imagine the future. I'm determined. I have these feelings. I want the future. I want to be in control of the future. I want to bring forth and manifest the future. I mean, you might be thinking, oh, like Sigma male guy driving it and the vaporwave stuff is kind of like all the way thrown back into the 80s, and there's ruins and stuff. It might seem as though like it's out of control, but underlying it all, there's a masculine energy, and there's kind of like a feeling of resentment as well, strong feeling of resentment that you get there. Not just nostalgia. It's a double-edged sword, really. this other side to it where it's, wanting to be in control of the future. There's the sunset setting, the sunset in the horizon. That's a frequent motif that's used. There's this feeling like, okay, the sun has set, but feelings still remain. How I feel about the future that was stolen from us, that still remains with me. That still resonates. It's kind of holding up a mirror to all of that we feel inside ourselves. And so, what was your final question? The final point that you just hit on there, Hugo, and I said I was going to say, it's kind of escaped me a little bit.
About the acceleration of time and how we feel that things
Yeah,
are
I'm sorry.
going
Thank you for that. Yeah, sorry. It just and I think that's why the music itself, like you listen to retro wave, it's like this fast sort of, like it's like a mixture of stuff you would have heard from 80s and 90s soundtracks. And it's very fast and it's upbeat. And, I know guys who will listen to that at the gym because it's got that rhythm to it. I think all of that masculine energy and those feelings, I get the strong sense that, there's this feeling of wanting to harness the technology. What's making everything seem to be going so much faster, all the rest of it was like, it's the internet, it's all of these tools and all of this technology, and we feel as though really we're a slave to the system. We're a slave to technology. We don't have the tools in our hand. We're cogs in some larger machine. And so it's, I'm using some of the thought of Ivan Illich there, who, that was his big thing, wasn't it? About, we should, he said basically we should only allow tools and technology in society that, we can, even as individuals, like properly control, and they're going to be empowering us. Not sure what he would have made of the internet or what's going on now, but it's very much that energy. It's that energy of wanting to harness all of that. And you said we won't talk about the Austrian painter. He was the first one that came to mind just now. But think of the futurists in Italy. That was their whole thing, right? It's not that they were pure individualists and were like all about radical innovation. They were still like nationalists, so they still had a sense of the group. But they understood that we need to be taking control of the technology. We need to harness the technology, take the reins, and steer everything in a direction. And for me, the aesthetic renaissance going on the right at the moment, it's basically saying, the world has gone mad and we kind of don't fit in anymore, and things are going crazy, and the future's kind of like uncertain, and it's not how we once imagined it would be over 20 years ago. But we're not done dreaming. We are the ones who have a sense of reality. We're real human beings. We know what's real. We know what's right. We know the direction that we want things to go. And we have that energy. And, we're not done. Even if we're driving alone at night, we're off into the sunset and we're just dreaming away, and our car is covered in neon lights for some unknown reason. The feelings remain, the dream remains, and our sense of direction is there. And all of that basically implies that if we were to have political power manifest, we could do something great. We could manifest the future that we feel was stolen from us. Those are all my feelings about it, anyway.
Well, and that's a great way to finish, especially because to get from the history of law to the aesthetics of a future lost is a complicated way of engaging with a topic, but it's quite a good one, to be honest. It might have been a little bit autistic, especially for normies, but that's how it works in these kind of spheres of intellectual engagement. In general, I'm happy with the conversation because it allows us to understand and to explain a lot of topics that are not really known especially in Hispanic America. They don't really know about all of this. There are ways to articulate this, especially for my region and for my fellow kinsmen, is that we have a particular tradition, a Hispanic tradition, which is different from the one that Anglo people have, and from the one that Slavs have, and from French people, and so on and so forth. The thing is that we are part of the same Western civilization, even if there are different ways of understanding. And so far, the greatest problem we're seeing is that we have lost our way as a civilization. We no longer understand the true meaning of freedom. We no longer understand how to engage and how to create meaningful order, how to create beauty, how to achieve transcendence. So I think that part of our fight for civilization is a fight for the truth, for beauty, for goodness itself, which is complicated to explain to normies, because normies, they are completely insulated from these ideas.
Yeah, absolutely. But I mean, that's why it's a culture war, right? We've got to break the enemy lines, as it were, figuratively speaking, of course.
Yeah, well, thank you very much, Richard. I'm going to link your book in the description as well for anyone who might be interested in reading it. I read it. It's a great book, especially because you begin with a similar topic with legal history and end up engaging in a whole manifesto of political philosophy, trying to, how to call it, try to create as a new fusionism, which is something that many people have tried in the libertarian, the conservative spheres in political philosophy. But it's complicated, and I don't think we have quite gotten to that point. Anyway,
but just to say, it's due to be, it's not published in Spanish yet, but there's a South American publisher who's going to be publishing it in Spanish, thankfully, this year, sometime earlier this year. So keep an eye out for that.
Right. Thank you very much, Richard, and see you in another occasion. I'm probably going to try to create a new conversation with another guest as well, so you can debate about this. Thank you very much.
I look forward to it. Thank you.